We'll have a couple of seconds here as everybody joins. Thank you so much. If you are joining us right now, please put in the chat maybe where you're calling in from. We love to hear where everybody's calling in from. A couple of countries are presented there. Christian, where are you joining us from today? Looks like you're in the home office.
Yeah, I'm joining from New York City.
Oh, very nice. Okay, very good. Well, you should be right next door to me somewhere there. If I look out my window, I'm sure I'll see you somewhere. We're excited to have you here, obviously, to talk about the CFO playbook with Christian Wattig. You need no introduction, but of course, I'm going to give you one nevertheless. I'm the Director of Strategic Finance here at Drivetrain. If you're interested in learning more about us, we can talk more about that at the end. Christian, however, is who I have the privilege of interviewing today. And honestly, I don't know how much interviewing will be needed because he is going to be doing most of the presenting. But in short, Christian's an FP&A expert with 14 years of experience with multinational corporations like P&G, Unilever, and high-growth tech startups like Squarespace. After earning his MBA from NYU Stern, he helped take Squarespace public. Now he's an entrepreneur and he directs the FP&A Certificate Program at Wharton School of Business and, of course, runs his own firm, InsideFP&A.com. He offers corporate training there, online programs, and now with us, he's sharing his insights through LinkedIn newsletters and his FP&A Tuesday series. Christian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Kirk. I'm excited to be here.
It's going to be a privilege of ours. I can assure everybody on the call today. Budget season's around the corner. Of course, that's what we're talking about. This is what we plan to go through at a high level today. Obviously, number one there, we're going to walk through Christian's 5 phases of budgeting with those best practices, tackling those common hurdles from cross-functional and then AI collaboration. And just as a general note, always reach out to us, right? Christian is obviously a thought leader in this space. Drivetrain, we're not only an FP&A tool, but we also have our thought leadership, not only through our blogs, but with our diverse range of teams. And we touch pretty much every area of FP&A and strategic finance that you could think of. So please, at any point, reach out. More information on that a little bit later, but you can reach me at kirk.k@drivetrain.com. Let's start off, as we always do, with a poll. Here, question number 1. What's your biggest pain point during budget season? A couple of the answers: getting timely inputs from other teams, too many manual updates, lack of clarity around assumptions, consolidation. As you put those in, you might see some percentage answers there. That'll be important. Poll question number 2, what tool do you use to manage your budget process? Excel or Sheets, dedicated FP&A tool, others. Me growing up, I was always an Excel guy, but Google Sheets seems to be taking the helm, mainly for collaboration purposes. Looks like got about a 90% response rate on that one. All of the above, 36% for the main issues. I don't know if you have any thoughts here. Well, I'll tell you this. From what I see here, it looks like for question number 1, all of the above takes 1/3 of the answer. It seems like that seems to be the case. It's just everything is too much of a hassle. Also, a third of people put too many manual updates and versions, so version control. Maybe that'll be a big one we can touch on today. And then getting timely inputs from other team members. That's another third right there.
I love it.
What tools do you use? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I see it now. I love it that's the response, because that's exactly what we'll touch on today, especially getting timely inputs and how to speed up the process, etc. So this is great. We'll touch on all that.
Beautiful. It looks like only 10% of people are using a dedicated FP&A tool, so we can touch on that a little bit too towards the end. But as a segue into kind of your content here today, Christian, just a quick question. I hear that budgeting sometimes gets a bad rap. I don't know who said that, but I heard it once. Somebody once said they don't like budgeting. What are your thoughts about that in general?
Yeah, so I like that we're starting with that because, why not talk about the elephant in the room, right? The budgeting process is not everyone's most favorite process in the world. In fact, PricewaterhouseCoopers did a survey on this recently, and I'm going to share my screen here. So PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, is a big audit firm, and they ran a survey about what people think about the budgeting process, about annual planning, and what they saw was those are the most common responses. It takes too much time. It doesn't help me run the business. It's out of date before it's even finished. Too many iterations. It involves too many people. Cast in stone, includes allocations I can't control. Game playing, right? We'll talk about that as well. And by the time it's done, I don't even recognize my own numbers. Now, the thing is that these kind of objections come from one of two reasons. Either people misunderstand what budgeting is all about in the first place, we'll talk about that, or it's simply that these concerns come up because the budgeting process isn't run effectively. And hopefully you'll leave this webinar today with some ideas on how you can improve the effectiveness of your budgeting process. Now, to look a little bit closer at this, there are advantages and disadvantages of annual planning, right? On the side of the advantages, you use the budget for financial control and delegation. So what I mean with that is if you can give people an idea on how much they can spend, then you can empower them to make decisions within those guardrails, right? You don't have to confirm about every investment that they're doing, every small expense, because you're giving them a budget and that gives them guardrails. Helps with coordination as well. Let's say the head of product is eager to launch a new product, and so he hires researchers to develop this product. But if at the same time the company doesn't have resources in marketing, etc., to actually market that product, then there's a problem, right? And there could be cost overruns, etc. That's why it helps during the annual budgeting process about what are we trying to do and how much will that cost. Can be good for performance evaluation as well. You can use it for target setting, resource allocation, managing expectation, strategic reassessment, right? A lot of advantages. The disadvantages you sometimes hear is that it can be time consuming. Now, that concern usually ties back to not having enough value, because if you're getting a lot of value out of something, then you're fine with investing some time into the process. And we'll talk about later in this webinar about how you get more value out of your budget. Then there's outdated assumptions. And here, I have to bring it back to the purpose of an annual budget in the first place. A budget is not a forecast, right? Your budget is a commitment to stakeholders about what the company is trying to achieve in terms of financial performance and how the company plans to get there in terms of strategies, tactics, and investments. That's what a budget is, a commitment. So that's why it doesn't change. And that's why, it doesn't make sense to say, well, 6 months later, the assumptions are updated. That's what forecasts are for. Then there's short-term focus and the potential for misuse. What's important here is to make it clear with people that the budget isn't meant to be restrictive. The budget isn't meant to be, okay, once a year we decide how much money we are spending on things and that's it. And we don't care about what happens in the business. It doesn't make any sense, right? You need to constantly look at, okay, are there new opportunities that are worth pursuing even if they exceed the budget, right? And finance needs to have a process in place to evaluate those opportunities through financial modeling. Or, does our competitor do something which we need to respond to, which again would result in us exceeding our budgeted in amounts? You need to be ready for that. You need to be open to that. You can't say, well, the budget is the budget and we can't spend more than that. So you need to have a forecasting, financial modeling, analysis processes in place that make sure that your budget, you're flexible in terms of how you're spending. But it doesn't mean that you're changing your budget. The budget or the annual plan, I'm using those terms interchangeably, they're your commitment to your investors, to your stakeholders, and that commitment shouldn't change.
So that's super helpful, Christian. Interested on this. I know you've been responsible for many annual planning processes as a finance leader. What are some common themes or maybe best practices that you have seen in those processes? I know I'm super interested in those.
Yeah, so before we talk about common themes and best practices, I actually like to talk about a common misconception first. So if you take a look at this quote, plans are nothing, but planning is everything. It's one of my favorite quotes. It's accredited to a former US president, Eisenhower. But how it relates to planning is that your annual plan shouldn't be just about the documents you produce. Now, it shouldn't be just about a projected P&L, balance sheet, and cash flow statements. Those get outdated, right? Nobody has a magic crystal ball to project accurately what's going to happen 10 to 12 months out. But the benefit of the planning process comes from the process itself. And what I mean by that is that so everyone's busy, right? Everyone across the company, leaders are busy, they have their own fires to fight. But what you do during the planning process is you get them to actually take a step back, to step out of those day-to-day firefighting modes and have a deep conversation around, are our strategies still working? Should we try something else next year? How do those strategies translate to tactics? And how do we measure whether those tactics are successful? Do we have everything we need to measure success? What does success look like in the first place for all those tactics? So your budget needs to be much more than those financial projections, and you can only get there by collaborating with the team. The other Oh, I love it, Sarah. I just saw in the chat what's the difference between an AOP and a budget. That was actually exactly the next thing I wanted to talk about, Sarah. So the other misconception is that there is a difference between a budget and an operating plan. Sometimes companies use the terms interchangeably, but they're really not. They're two different things. So AOP stands for Annual Operating Plan, and the difference is that a budget in the traditional sense is just the financial projection, right? What the company plans to achieve, what the financial performance is expected to look like. But an operating plan, an AOP, an annual operating plan, adds the how. So how is the company planning to achieve their financial performance? So now we're talking about what does the sales headcount look like, for example? What is sales going to do? What different tactics are they going to use? What is marketing going to do to get more leads, right? Are they investing in the same channels, into new channels? What is product going to do? Are we launching any new products, any new features, any new services? How does that link with everything else? So that's why it's so important that you're not just doing a budget, you're actually doing an annual operating plan. And finance needs to lead that. Finance needs to lead that cross-functional process of let's look at our strategies, our tactics, and tie them back to performance. Now, you also asked me about the themes I saw in the best practices in the annual planning process, right, Kirk? I want to make sure to loop back to that
right.
because,
and I'm waiting eagerly for your great answers.
Yeah, because there's a lot to unpack there. So when you look at annual planning, really there are 5 phases, 5 distinct phases, and at each phase there's stuff that can go wrong and stuff that you can do well. So there's the pre-kickoff phase. It's all about planning the plan. There's the joint planning phase. It's all about asking the right questions. We'll get to that in a moment. There's the consolidation phase. What's the bottom line? Then there's an iteration phase, which is often where things can start to fall apart if you're not careful. We'll talk about that. And then there's the final alignment phase. We are all one team. So pre-kickoff, super important, and that's a phase that's often overlooked. What do I mean with kickoff? Well, kickoff is when you as the finance leader send out the communication to the different departments and say, hey, it's time for budgeting again. Here are the timelines, here are the deadlines, here's what I need from you, right? Before you do that, there's something that needs to happen. And the first thing is reviewing the previous year's plan. And I don't see a lot of finance teams do that when I train different companies, but it's super important. So look at the process. How long did it take you to do the budgeting process? How many months? Were there any delays? Was everybody on time, right? Actual results. How useful was your budget to help you with decision making? A lot of the value of the budget comes from comparing budget to actuals, to tell the story of why are we not on track to hit our commitment and what can we learn from that, right? And then hopefully you still have your notes from back then where you wrote down all the learnings about, okay, what do we want to do differently next time? And then you create the planning roadmap during this phase. You look at the timelines. You make sure that you get people's inputs early. It's very important. The deliverables. You put together any budget input collection templates. We'll talk about that more later. And then you think about ownership. And I'm a big fan of the RACI model here. For those of you who are not familiar, it stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And the idea is that the common problem in budgeting is that there's too many cooks in the kitchen, right? You have big meetings, you have endless meetings, and it seems like you're not making the decisions you need to make to get closer to locking down the budget. And sometimes it's simply because either people aren't 100% clear who is the decision maker, or you simply have too many people in the room who think they are the decision maker or are influencing the decision. So RACI, basically you say upfront and you share with people upfront, hey, this is who is responsible to do the work. This is who is accountable, so who will sign off at a higher level. This is who will be consulted on an individual basis. They won't join all the meetings. And this is who will only be informed after the fact. Perhaps your more junior employees, they shouldn't join any of the decision-making meetings. Okay. And then we implement the process improvements. And I would specifically focus on 3 key issues here: speed, accuracy, and trackability. Speed meaning how long did the process take? It shouldn't take longer than it needs to. Technology can make a big difference here. Having a planning tool, I saw that 90% of you only use Excel and Sheets. Not great for the budgeting process. We'll talk more about that later. And now tools like Drivetrain are available to make your life a lot easier there. Then there's accuracy. So accuracy, not in the sense of could we accurately predict sales in Q4, right? Very unlikely. But more about, was the budget accurate enough for us to use it for decision making? And then there's trackability. So this is crucial. What I mean with that is that the assumptions that go into your budget need to be measurable. So let me give you an example. When I worked at a tech company, our goal was, or the goal of the marketing team was to improve our brand equity. So basically, they wanted to run ads that help get our name out there, our brand name and what we do. But those ads didn't aim at selling anything, selling the product. They were just there to raise brand awareness. Now, the tricky part is how do you measure the return on investment of that, right? Because if you raise brand awareness, it can take a long time for that person who hears about you to then be ready to make a purchase later on, right? Or you may run other ads later that encourage someone to purchase. How do you know how much that earlier ad that they saw contributed there? So we spend a lot of time figuring out what's the right attribution model. We used a machine learning based approach to figure that out. We had data scientists look at it because we wanted to make sure that when we put this assumption in the budget, we will be able to later tell, is it working or is it not working? So trackability. Then there's the joint planning phase. The joint planning phase is where the business teams create a bottom-up, FP&A creates a top-down, and together FP&A and business teams compare plans and discuss variances. So this is, and then teams assess risk and opportunities and prepare a joint plan for the department. This involving both teams is crucial. You don't want this to be just a finance exercise because then the depth of the assumptions is too thin to be useful for variance analysis. And you also don't want just the business leader, the department heads to send you inputs and all finance does is consolidation. That's, we're being paid more than playing the role of a consolidator in finance. There's a lot of value on the table if you do either way. Ideally, really, the two teams need to work together. Business teams create a bottom-up, finance creates a top-down, and finance challenges the bottom-up, to ask challenging questions, to understand the risks, the opportunities, the ranges, and uses the top-down that finance creates to challenge the bottom up. So let's dig a bit deeper into that. What do I mean by that? First of all, top-down and bottom-up planning, super important framework to understand. Essentially, the top-down starts with the end result in mind. It's about expectation setting, and it's usually prepared by either senior leaders or finance. And at the same time, though, it shouldn't just be, oh, we should be able to grow 8% in revenue next year. That's not a top-down plan. That's wishful thinking, right? A top-down plan still needs to tie back to business drivers. So what will I do differently next year to achieve that growth or that profitability that I'm hoping to achieve? So it needs to tie back to headcount, to how much are we planning to change in advertising? How much are we planning to change on product development, on market expansion, etc. And it also needs to take external drivers into account, like what are our competitors going to do? So that's a top-down plan. And then the departments prepare the bottom-up. That starts from scratch. They look at all the different initiatives, the different campaigns, the different projects, and then they add them up and they see where does that take them, right? It needs to be detailed, and it shouldn't be influenced too much by targets or by other areas, because you want people to flag, okay, is this realistic? And the key part here then becomes that you do the top down and the bottom up separately, because they rarely, if ever, match. I ran 11 annual planning processes, and the bottom up never matched the top down expectations ever, But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it opens up a conversation around what's realistic, what really makes sense. Because usually bottom-ups are conservative leaning, right? It's about people want to lower expectations so they can exceed their goals, right? And do more than they said. So they always ask for more money, and they'll always lowball, leads and revenue, etc. a bit. The top-down, on the other hand, is prepared by finance or by leadership. They're much more ambitious, and they're a bit removed from the business, right? And so the top-down plan tends to be on the aggressive side. Less money, more results. And then when you combine them and when you have a conversation about the difference between them, that's where you can unlock a lot of value and a lot of understanding of the business. That's why it's so important to do both. Now, what does a top-down look like? I'm a big fan of a driver-based plan. So a driver-based plan is where you look at, okay, what are the things that we're going to do differently? And then what do we think that will yield in terms of results? In this case, the example I have here on the screen, I'm looking at a subscription-based model, a subscription-based company, like think Netflix, for example. And at this company, we looked at, okay, we want to increase unaided awareness. I mentioned that. We want to also spend more in our direct response budgets. We have an assumption for inflation and a promo strategy and an assumption for when we don't do anything different. And then we have 3 scenarios. And that's where a lot of the value comes in, because the balanced scenario here may not be what you need, right? May not meet expectations. But then you can say, well, an unaided awareness, we've done a lot of work with our data scientists. We feel comfortable with the aggressive scenario. Whereas, with direct response marketing, we invested so much in the past, I don't think it makes sense to expect for more there. And that allows you to tell a very clear story about the risk you're taking in your planning process and where you're taking that risk. Fantastic for board presentations and answering those questions that will for sure come about the level of risk. Pros and cons, of driver-based planning. It's about an analysis of what matters. It forces you to figure out, okay, what are the 5 to 10 things that really move the needle? It enables scenario planning. It's useful throughout the year, right? And it allows you to fine-tune the level of risk, what I mentioned before. Hold on, that's an important point. Why is it useful throughout the year? Because every month, every quarter, you can pull it out of your drawer and make adjustments according to what you have learned. And that then informs your forecast. And the disadvantages are, well, it requires that business understanding and can be time intensive if that's not there. And there might be a risk that if you have many drivers, there's a bigger risk of error because each of them introduces some uncertainty. But overall, I'm a big fan of driver-based planning. Really briefly, that's a big topic. There's a lot more to say about this, and I do in my courses, but I wanted to give you some best practices here. Business drivers are not P&L lines. You can't just put marketing, sales, customer service there. That's not detailed enough, right? It needs to be on the tactics level, on the things that you're actually doing differently next year. You need to have an 80-20 approach. You can't have 100 drivers there. It becomes unmanageable. It uses a lot of its value, but you want to have 5 to 10 of the most impactful drivers. And collaboration is crucial. Finance can't do this alone. There needs to be some business partnering around that as well. And ideally, you're not starting from scratch. You have done this process throughout the entire year. And when it comes to budgeting season, you can build on what you have already done on a regular basis. Then there's zero-based budgeting. I just wanted to put that out there very briefly because it's another process to help the cross-functional team with the bottom-up. So zero-based budgeting is extremely detailed. Essentially, you look at each expense individually almost, and then look at, okay, are we happy with the vendor? Could there be a cheaper vendor out there? Does this have a positive return on investment? If not, we negotiate it, we remove it, and if yes, we keep it. And so it's a very detailed review of the existing expenses about, okay, what should we keep, what should we not keep? Has a few. The main disadvantages is can be time intensive, can reward short-term focus, but it's fantastic if you need to look for cost savings, if you want to improve the efficiency of your budget. And I would actually encourage you to give it a try, but not during the budgeting season itself. Do it earlier, right? And then you're much better prepared for actually doing the budgeting when it can get hectic. Best practices, don't do it all at once, right? Do it for one department at first where you think it can have a big difference. Bring the cross-functional team on board. You hear me say that almost like a broken record. And consider doing ring fences instead of cuts. So if you don't have to drop everything to the bottom line, still make those adjustments and then say, hey, we ring fence this budget so you can earn it back. Just pitch your project. Tell us about a way you can spend the money with high ROI and we'll give you the money back. Okay, so really quick dip into the budgeting process there. After the joint planning phase is the consolidation phase, the input collection phase. I saw that 90% of you do this in Excel, so this might be very familiar to you. You create a template where you give the different department heads the actual results. And then you have fields where you want them to fill out, okay, where do they think they will be in the future? A few things to point out here. Version control is extremely important, right? If you're doing this in Excel, this can sometimes cause headaches when you get lots of versions and you have to make sure that you use the latest one or the one that got the sign off from the department head, right? Sometimes they're not one and the same. So make sure you collect who submitted the version and then also when in the file. Talk more about budget collection later. But I wanted to make sure I spend some time on the iteration phase because the iteration phase is where it gets hectic. Like I mentioned, the initial bottom-up is almost never in line with what leadership expectations are. So you need to send people back and say, sorry, you need to do more with less, right? You need to achieve more leads, more sales with less resources. It's usually how it is. And what can be very helpful there is if you use the driver-based method. So I use SofaFlix as an example here, as a made-up company to show that, well, if your budget is just one column, And then you have to, and it doesn't meet expectations, you have to go back to the drawing board. But if you request the inputs as a range, even for the bottom up, you can do that. You can set it up in your templates, etc. In the conversations, don't ask people to say what they think they need in Q1 to hit the sales target. Ask them for a range, right? Ask them from to. That makes it easier, because then you don't have to go back to the budget owners when there's a gap between expectations, but you can just look at the more aggressive range, right? Of course, you communicate that. And the other advantage of asking for a range is that you can see how wide that range is. And that tells you something about the level of uncertainty that people have when you look at the budget.
So
and with
quick
that,
question for you,
hand it back to you.
Christian.
Yeah.
I've got a couple from the audience and then a couple from me. First one here from Austin Muya. She said, many companies spend months on the budget only for it to be obsolete within a few quarters due to market changes. What is your top framework for building a living budget and ensuring a continuous forecasting process rather than just an annual one and done exercise? In other words, how can we keep this as a living document? What processes can we have?
Yes, the first step is that you need to have a process to reforecast. I trained a relatively large company a few months ago, and I realized that they only reforecast once a year. So they do the budgeting process, and then in the middle of the next year, they do another forecast update. That's not enough. You need to reforecast at least monthly or quarterly, and ideally that forecast then ties back to your budget. So it's not disconnected. And, you need to set up your budget at the right level of detail to be able to do that. A driver-based forecast is a great way to do this, because then you can, every month, every quarter, you can refresh it. The other important note there is, it's okay if the budget is different from the actuals, because the budget isn't meant to be an accurate projection, it's a commitment. And so then in the variance analysis, that's where you're getting value from your budget, because you're looking at where are we now, where did we think we would be when we put the budget together? Why is there a gap? Really understand the root causes of that gap, and then use that root cause to make a recommendation about what the company should be doing differently. And that really is, to me, one of the most important deliverables of FP&A is making those recommendations. And you can only do that if you have a comparator to your performance in the budget. If it's done at the right level of detail, can be a great comparison.
Beautiful. No, that's super helpful. And so one more here, just from me. When you have a BP over 5 years that is part of a shareholder agreement, how do you manage your annual budget process? I'm not 100% sure what BP means there, maybe budget plan. So I think it's a budget plan longer than 5 years.
You mean when you have a strategic plan that's longer and then you have an annual plan? Yeah, so the strategic plan is, so the strategic plan informs the budget, but the budget should not have to match the strategic plan. That's super important, because the strategic plan is done at a different level of detail. It's much more high level, and it's done for different reasons, right? It's for guardrails, for long-term strategies. And then, so you might have to help explain the difference a bit, but you definitely shouldn't feel like you have to match that strategic plan. It just informs the budget and helps you with getting started and set some high level expectations.
Okay, perfect. Well, I know you've got a lot more to get through. I think this next piece hits on my next question, which is obviously nothing ever goes the way it should. So what are the biggest challenges that people face on these phases that you've mentioned? Like, what are the biggest obstacles that come up, the biggest challenges they face, and how can they kind of rise above it and deal with those when they do come?
Yeah. One of the number one challenges is that departments submit inputs late. So you set a budget deadline 4 weeks before the board meeting, right? You think, 4 weeks is plenty of time to finish the numbers and then the presentation. But then people wait until the day of the deadline. They submit something and it's miles away from where it needs to be, right? both in terms of depth of analysis, depth of thinking, and where the numbers are. Then it can become a challenge because now you don't have that much time anymore. Maybe the board wants to see the deck a week before the meeting, and then you have to run around and you have to see, okay, how can I quickly get there? It's much better, and I have that as number one point here, to implement a staggered timeline. What that means, and actually I'll go back to this slide, but I'll go to the next slide because this illustrates it. A staggered timeline means that you have multiple deadlines where you ask for inputs. So in this case, for example, we kick off in the beginning of November. And then if you look at that black bar, there's a first pass deadline in the end of November. And then I have a second pass in mid of December. And the final deadline when everything has to be logged would be in mid-January in this case. So what this does is that people submit their inputs much earlier. You have much more time to understand the numbers, to analyze, to challenge, to question, to run scenarios. And then most likely that first pass is not what you need. People go back to do more work. They come back for the second pass deadline. Now, this only works, I have to say, this only works if you have the support from very senior leaders. Ideally the CEO, for larger companies, the senior vice presidents, because the first pass deadline will only be really respected if there's a business review after that, right? If leaders actually review those numbers and then send it back for changes. So you need to have that buy-in. But when you have that, can make a big difference. The other points I have on the slide here, pretty straightforward. I'm not going to talk more about them, but implementing a staggered timeline is really where you can make a big difference. Another challenge is that departments don't want to collaborate, or they feel like they're too busy to partner with finance and have a lot of meetings about the budgeting process. Sometimes that's because, they feel like they don't really understand the value of it. I hope that, now you have a better chance of communicating that after watching this, or they don't feel like it's really database enough. They lack information. So you have to see, how can I help you help me, right? What else do you need to know about the business? And sometimes it's that they feel like it's not helping them make better decisions. So this is where you want to make it clear to people that, hey, if you have an expensive idea that can have a huge impact on the company, I can help you. I can help you get the funding for that. You don't need to think, we always get the same amount of money every year. I'm never going to be able to do this campaign or this initiative. That's what the budgeting process is for, right? That's why it's collaborative. Tell us what you need. We'll do the analysis and we work out together if we can make that happen. And then sometimes people feel like, I'm just going to have to do whatever finance says anyway. So why even participate if there's no flexibility? Again, the budget doesn't change, but what people are allowed to spend should change according to the business realities and then reflected in the forecast. And sometimes, it comes down to getting the support from the top. And the third challenge is that consolidation can take too much time. So what I mean with that is, you got back to bottom up and you got a lot of Excel files from 10 different departments. And then finance needs to roll it up to see what's the total company profit, what the total company revenue, because that's how leaders look at, okay, does that match expectations? If that consolidation process takes you more than a day, then by the time you're finished, there might be new updates, right? And then you're just chasing your tail. Fortunately, there is a better way than doing it in Excel, and tools like Drivetrain do a much better job and just also take a lot of stress out of the process, because it's not just about time, it's also, are all the formulas working? Did I make a mistake? Did I accidentally use the wrong version? Was it version 2.1 or 2.3 that was the latest one, right? So I actually want to hand it over to Kirk for this, because I'd like to see how a tool like Drivetrain can actually make this process easier. And I think it will be very illuminating to people.
Yeah, sure. I can definitely take a look at that. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big Excel lover myself. Back in the day, Excel was the only tool I was using. But obviously, every company reaches that point where they just need more than 1,048,000 rows. And so hence tools like Dragon can be quite helpful. We still use DAX expressions, so all the Excel lingo that we love, if and or min max, that's all here. This here is actually our integrations page. This is where you would kind of connect your data sources. If you come up here, just
Oh, hold
choose the
on.
system you
Sorry, we
want.
don't see it. We don't see it. You have to share
Oh,
again.
yeah, no problem. Let me jump back here. How's that? Is that a little bit easier?
There you go. There you go.
Beautiful. Yeah, this is that integrations page. So what the idea is here is that you shouldn't have to work with an IT team or consultants to connect. You should just be able to log in. Every tool is a little bit different, right? You've got your ERPs, you'll have something as simple as spreadsheets, maybe something as complex as data warehouses. But either way, whether it's a currency exchange provider or an accounting tool, you should just be able to log in. From there, what do we do? Well, most of the time people are actually going to come up here and they're going to have their various different templates that they want to integrate with. For the most part, we are a big believer in the three-statement model build. So you should have a fully integrated three-statement model. Revenue goes to net income to the cash flow to ending cash, and ending cash to back over to the balance sheet. That will, of course, end up in budget world, something like this, right? This is just the P&L piece. But the idea here is that I should be able to interact with my team at a detailed level across the budget, observing the variances between the two. Now, this looks quite high level, but the whole point of a dimension-based tool is that I can say, actually, I want to see this by department, and now sales and marketing opens up by department. If I want to call somebody out and say, okay, let's just, quickly take a look at this. Maybe over here, I want to show a calculation, show the underlying data, or maybe I just want to inspect it. I should be able to do that as well, leaving any commentary I want to. Maybe I could say, Alice, hey, this is high, right? Whatever I want to do, I can make it visible to everybody or just the budget leaders. Either way, when I send that, I want them to get a ping in Slack, Teams, email, or up in Drivetrain itself. Now, the biggest pain point of all is obviously when I have my budget or actuals, or perhaps when I've got my actual budget and then a reforecast, right? In which I'm now going to be doing monthly, by the way, Christian, due to your point. All of those take a lot of time to investigate. We've obviously put a lot of work into AI because we are an AI native tool to help us generate some commentary around it so that as I'm doing my investigation, the wording will be done for me. I'm going to interact with this. Maybe I want to add it to my report. And now, of course, I can still work with this, right? I can still add whatever I like to this, magnetize it around to make it good. And then I can say, revenue came in at, and then just reference the revenue metric, which is quite nice as well, so that when I save this down, I'm seeing a consistently changing number. As timelines change, so too will my numbers change. So that piece is quite important. In fact, for the most part, from a budget perspective, I wouldn't even have them update here. I would likely have them update in a template that can be viewed differently depending on the user. So when I log in, I want to see every single department here. But when my head of engineering logs in, I just want them to see their tools, their actuals, their forecast formulas, and then how those forecasts are materializing. Then, of course, this vendor model would feed back into the OpEx. But you can imagine this from a budgetary perspective. You have all these various different templates from like dollars needed to revenue generation to operational metrics. If everyone just views it slightly differently, that means that I don't need to make this page 90 different times to say, this is the page for R&D, this is the page for G&A. I can just make it once and change their permissions. And then, of course, from a reporting side, the way that looks is that when that head of engineering logs in here, they just see, their head count for engineering. If they want to take a look at the attrits, they only see the attrition for engineering rather than what I would see. I would see, all 52 in this case. That's very high level. But the point here is just I should only be able to give access to people that need to see the things that they need to see and nothing else, so that no one's messing up my models, so that it's a streamlined budgeting process and we can create reports like this, just one of them viewed several different ways, rather than creating 30 of them that I need to manage. If I want to add a new chart, I need to add it to all 30. So I'll stop there, Christian, because I want to get back to your stuff. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, and actually there are a few really interesting things that you showed very quickly, but that I didn't even talk about earlier, which is another big issue with the budget is that you have so many emails flying around, right? So, oh yeah, this number needs to change, that needs to change. And it was very cool to see that you can do this with comments in the budget, right? Because Sure, you could have Google Sheets and have comments there, but then you still have the issues with the different versions, right? And in Drivetrain, everything is neatly organized. Also fantastic that leaders then can directly see the information in visualization form, right? With graphs and column charts and all that. That's another thing that's just super painful to do in Excel, is to keep updating those charts that you paste in the PowerPoint, and you paste again and you paste again after all those changes. So that's great to see. And then you mentioned AI. Also cool to see that you already have that built into the tool. What I wanted to do as the last thing today before we talk about Q&A is actually to look a bit deeper into how people can use ChatGPT and other AI in their day-to-day when they do budgeting, right? And the most important thing when it comes to using AI is the prompt, right? How you ask the question. And let me share a framework here for prompting. This is not a framework that I came up with. It's the framework that Greg Brockman shared. So for those of you who don't know who he is, he's the co-founder and current president of OpenAI, the company that makes ChatGPT. So I thought that if there's someone who knows how to write a prompt, it must be the president of OpenAI, right? So he shared this. He said, okay, this is the anatomy of an O1 is one of the models, a prompt. You have a goal, a return format, warnings, and context dump. So here he has an example of he wants to find a hike that he can do with his girlfriend. So he says, I want a list of the best medium-length hikes. But then it's important that you don't just put your goal there. You need to put more into the prompt. And that's the biggest mistake that I see when I teach AI for finance, is that, I ask people to open up AI and do something with it, and they put in, 1 or 2 sentences. That's not enough. You need to give it more. So you need to, here he says, well, return the name of the hike as I'd find it on All Trails. That's an app, provide the address, etc. To return the top 3. And then he includes warnings. Be careful to make sure that the name of the trail is correct, that it actually exists, and that the time is correct, right? You shouldn't have to ask this theoretically, right, when you're talking to a person. But where AI is right now is that it's still important to make sure that it double checks its work. And when you're working with reasoning models like O1, like O3 of ChatGPT or 2.5 Pro of Gemini, the latest Claude and Grok models also do reasoning. When you're working with a reasoning model, it's important to tell it what to check, because it goes in and it checks itself, and those warnings make sense. And then the context dump. So when I saw that, I thought that was very unique, a very different way of doing prompting. Basically, he puts a big blob of text here. My girlfriend and I hike a ton. We've done pretty much all of the hikes. He gives more context, because why not, right? The AI doesn't know anything about what you're trying to do here or about you. Why not give it more context? Now, what I wanted to do next is to show you how to apply that in the annual budgeting process. So I'm in ChatGPT now. This is ChatGPT 03, one of the reasoning models. I have temporary chat enabled, so it doesn't interfere, because it has memory now, and it doesn't interfere with the memory I have. It says, I'm a finance manager at a software company. I need to speak with my chief marketing officer about their bottom-up submissions. And I would like to ask them questions on how they believe our company can improve ROI on marketing and investments. That's the goal, right? The objective of the conversation is to make our company more efficient with our marketing spend. That's the goal. Then I have the return format here, how I want it to be displayed, and then I have some warnings. For each question, make sure the data can be used to run a financial analysis and eventually make a concrete recommendation. I provide some context. Note that I'm more junior than our CMO, and I would like this conversation to be as collaborative as possible without feeling imposing. It's about the tone, about the style. And then there's also some context around, well, I would like to impress our chief financial officer. I don't meet the CMO that often, right? A little bit more context. Now let's see what we get here. It's always, you never know what you get, right? Because this is live. 5 respectfully framed data-oriented questions. Let's see. I'd love to understand which marketing programs you feel are already a punch up above their weight. Could we review the last 12 months alongside revenue? I like that it starts with that question because it starts on a positive note. It allows the CMO to brag a bit about all the stuff that's working great already. I like that that's the first question. Looking forward, which campaign do you see as the biggest bets? Could we outline the key assumptions? Okay, so I like the framing of saying what are the biggest bets rather than where are you unsure or what do you think might not work well, right? I like the framing of the bets. And then it also includes some specific data to request and how you can use it to boost ROI. So I like the table format. Asks about customer lifetime value. It asks about any quick wins, about tooling. So I find that this is very useful. And this, by the way, is one of my favorite ways to use AI is to help you brainstorm, right? Because when it comes to brainstorming, it's not about facts. It doesn't matter if it makes things up. I wanted to make things up, right? And you don't have to worry about this hallucination issue that sometimes it makes up facts that don't exist. So that's why I like this questioning, and I find it super helpful to prepare, for these annual budgeting conversations.
That's super cool, Christian. I really like that. Thank you for sharing. I'm hearing more and more every day. Finance leaders are learning how to leverage AI for their day-to-day processes and all these different ways of doing it and how you handle it. Do you have any workflow tips that we could help or show for budget planning on those things?
Workflow tips. So when it comes to workflow, sharing a detailed timeline schedule like I had on before makes a big difference, right? So where you have the different super clear about who needs to do what by when. And then it's project management in the end, right? Finance needs to be a project manager in this case. We need to have a strategy for following up. We need to have a strategy for reiterating the deadlines and communicating the reason behind them. And then, it's better. But the key, realization is that this is a project and you need to treat it like a project manager would any other professional project.
Beautiful. And then one question here, and I might have even lost it. It was regarding the changing of prompt answers. You ask it a question and then you ask it again and it gives you 2 different answers. How do you handle that? What's the caveat to gather that?
You mean following up on a prompt?
Yeah, so you ask it a question, it gives you an answer, and then you ask it the same question, you get a slightly different answer.
Oh, that's okay. So like I said, I like to use it. I don't ask the AI how many people live in Paris, France, right? Because that's something that it could make up, that could be wrong. You could ask the same question twice. It gives you 2 different answers. But when I ask, hey, can you help me brainstorming which questions I should ask my CMO in these situations? It's actually totally fine if I submit it twice and it gives me 5 different questions the next time, right? I might actually value that. I might actually purposefully click the redo button to see, does it give me other questions? Or just do a follow-up and say, give me 5 more questions, give me 5 more questions, right?
Beautiful.
So differentiate between fact and brainstorming. Sorry. No, just differentiate between facts, differentiate between asking about facts, sometimes Googling them is better, or using a search engine, and brainstorming AI can be really helpful. But it will get better with the facts too. It's important that we take into account how fast they are changing. And in a week from now, you may be totally fine to ask about the number of people who live in Paris, France.
Sure. Yeah, they are changing quickly. Now, I've got a couple more questions here for you, but before I do, I want to launch the poll really quickly, just so we can get that final one out. This one asks, would you like to explore a demo of Drivetrain's capabilities? So if what you saw before was interested to you at all, we would love to give you a demo of that and just go in a bit more detail about your use case. Secondly, and this is more general, did you find this webinar a good use of your time? Obviously, we want to improve these as much as we can to give you guys back some real information that makes it super usable and bring back to your teams, share it with them. So any feedback there would be super helpful. While that's being answered there, Christian, here I've got an anonymous attendee, and I would ask this anonymously too. How can we challenge the inputs and assumptions shared by department heads in a way that does not cause friction? Write a book if you can answer that one. What's the best way?
Great question. The best way is to do your homework first. Do a top-down, even if it's just a back of the envelope estimate of the numbers you got from the department head, and then have a meeting and say, hey, you know, I did my own projection for the budget. Here are my assumptions. Here is where I'm ending up at. Can you walk me through where your assumptions differ? Right? That's a totally different way than if you go to them and say, your number looks low, we need to get that up, let's talk about that, right? So come prepared and then have them contrast their projections from yours and have them walk through how did they come up with them, right? Step by step, because maybe there's a way that you can help them with your planning background.
Got it. One more here I've got from Nana. It says, what are the most compelling ways to communicate the values of budgeting to leadership in a non-finance driven organization? So it looks like numbers aren't valued as much as maybe they should be. What would your take be there to get that across to them?
It comes down to figuring out what do people care about, right? Maybe you're in a business that's doing very well, it's growing rapidly, and people don't really care that much about how much they're spending right now or what the profitability is. But maybe your CEO then cares about, is this growth sustainable, right? How many years can we keep growing like that? At which point do we run into issues? And then you run your budgeting process to answer that question. Or, you know, you might be in a nonprofit process background where in the past, you know, you had the funding you needed to do what you need to do, but then the budgeting process can be about, okay, what do we do if some of that funding falls through, right? A lot of nonprofits had to deal with that in the last year, and what could our scenario planning look like to deal with that? Because the advantage then is that when the worst case happens, you already have a plan prepared. You don't have to start from scratch, and you don't have to run around and do it very quickly. So that's just some food for thought. But really what it comes down to is asking the leaders, what do they worry about the business, about the future of the business, and then how can you help them address that through planning.
Beautiful. No, and this is of a similar vein, this question. It said, what non-monetary goals do you consider / include during the AOP start?
It's a good question. So I would reframe this, and rather than saying what non-monetary goals do you consider including, you look at the strategies. You look at how do the different parts of the company, how are they planning to reach their goals? How are they planning to grow the top line? And then you work backwards from there. You look at what non-monetary values, what non-monetary metrics do I need to track? So for example, if product quality is an important goal and the strategy is to improve product quality, then maybe you should track the number of your hotline calls, of your consumer hotline call, and look at, is it trending up? Is there a sudden increase somewhere which could point to a product quality issue, which you can then link back to sales? Because if your product quality drops, your sales may very likely drop as well, especially if you're a subscription company, right? Because then there might be more churn. So always start with the strategy, start with the tactics, and then the non-monetary metrics will become obvious.
Beautiful. Well, Christian, we got 1 minute left. Is there anything you would like to leave people with? The one thing they should all remember before they go on with their budget season?
Yeah, the most important takeaway of all of this is it needs to be a collaborative budget process where you do more than collecting the inputs, and where you do more especially than doing the projections yourself as a finance leader. Get that bottom up from the team, challenge the bottom up with your top down, and go through yes, it can be painful to have many iterations, to have a bottom up that's far away from your top down, but it's through that pain that there's a lot of value and a lot of gain.
Well, that is time for us, Christian. Thanks so much for joining. Everybody, thanks for jumping on with us. We look forward to seeing you the next time. Christian, once again, have a great day.
Thank you.